Alrighty. Thank you all for coming. I'm Summer. I'm the curator here at the museum. Before we get started, everybody please take a second to turn off or silence your phones so we don't have any disruptions. There's a seat there, a couple seats at this table. I see one in that large group right there. As for announcements, our Cottages and Courtyards tour will be on Saturday, April 2nd from 10 a.m. to 4 p.m. Tickets are now on sale, and there's information about the tour at that back table by the door. It also includes information about the after party called the Spirit of Spring at the Addison. Also, our annual golf tournament will be on April 8th. Information cards about that with registration forms on the back are also at that back table. As for upcoming programs, our March 3rd on the 18th will be with Michael Ray Fitzgerald, who will discuss his book Jacksonville and the Roots of Southern Rock. We also have a temporary exhibit opening this month on March 25th. This is the annual student-led exhibit curated by a group of local high school students. This year's exhibit is entitled Nassau County's African American Schools and discusses 3 of our areas of black schools during the segregation period. The exhibit opening will feature a panel of alumni from these schools to talk about their experiences. Also, if you have an evaluation sheet at your table, please fill it out after the program and return it to the basket at that back table as well. So that's it for announcements, but today we have Susan Martin. During her career, Susan worked in corporate planning and as a VP of professional services. She has lived on Amelia Island permanently since 2009 and has been active with the museum since she moved here, previously serving as board chair. She is currently a board member and a docent. So everyone please welcome Susan.
Full crowd. Thank you very much. Thank you to all the women for coming, and to the few men who are here too. That was just a joke. But anyway, we are going to talk about the women, some of the women of Amelia Island. I did this talk originally in December at the Amelia Island Club for the membership there. We have a program with them where we provide speakers to them, and I did this talk in December. I did 7 women at that time. I decided to cut it down to 5. It'll make the timing a lot better, but there were so many, I just wanted to say that, so many women to pick from, it was hard to cut 2 of my ladies out. But anyway, we are going to talk about 5 of the most interesting, funny, and impactful women that lived on Amelia Island, starting back in the late 1700s. So we'll start with one that a lot of people maybe have never heard of, and she was born in the 1700s. We don't know where and we don't know when, and her name is Felipe the Witch. So, and I don't have a picture of it, or a painting or anything, but we'll get to something in a minute. No one knows where she came from. No one knows where she was born. She first shows up in Old Town in 1815, and Old Town was platted out in 1811, so very shortly after the beginning of Old Town. She was a free woman of color. If those of you who are not familiar with the old Spanish structure of race relations prior to our acquisition by the United States, there were whites, there were free blacks, and there were slaves. 3 separate classes, and they interacted in much the ways you would expect. The free blacks had almost every single, every single right that free whites had. It was a very complicated society, but Philippa was a free black. She owned 2 lots in Old Town, up here marked in orange, 2 lots side by side. She lived on one, the other one was her garden. Her next door neighbors on either side, the 4 lots on that particular street, were also owned by free blacks. She was very good at what she did. We know she grew things like dill, rosemary, foxglove, belladonna, dandelion, henbane, chives, moonwort. Kind of takes you back to Harry Potter if you think about it. But she grew all those things. She was called a healer. People call her Felipe the Witch. I grew up in Massachusetts, 2 towns away from Salem, so I know a lot about this. Most of the women who were persecuted as witches, even in Salem, were healers or what they called physics, P-H-Y-S-I-C-K, an old-time word for physician. They, of course, couldn't be physicians, but they were healers. They primarily dealt with women's issues and, of course, were very much looked down on by male people of the medical world. So that was Felipe's position in Old Town. Her service was mostly to women. Here's a picture, the best picture I've got of Felipe. That is our Director of Tours and Volunteers, Nancy Graves. And this picture, and there's the Rogers right next to it. This is a picture from a program we did about 6 years ago, I think, I don't really remember, called Tough Times, Strong Women. And it was a repertoire of about 6 or 8 people who dressed up as characters. Those of you who attended it remembered we had it at the Tiger Marina, and the biggest thunderstorm I'd seen in 5 years came through and we had to just shut the place down. So we remounted it here in Baker Hall, and this is Thea with her herbal medicines trying to cure some people in the audience. In addition to the 2 lots she owned, she had a thriving business in probably a small building or something that she rented on Lady Street. That was her place of business. As I mentioned, her main areas of expertise were childbirth and women's issues. People came to her with any issue related to that, and she would give them herbs or treatments or other things, or suggest things they could do. People also brought her their infants if they were not thriving or had other issues. She had other things she could do for that. Men, as I researched this, brought their livestock to her for whatever reason. But we suspect that men also saw her for certain male issues in private or while they were having their livestock looked at. But we don't know much about that. For 90% of the people, or maybe more, in Old Town, this was the closest thing to medical care that they got, men or women. So she served a very, very useful purpose. Of course, some of it worked, some of it didn't, but a lot of it, in fact, did work. We know Chinese ancient medicine has some very deep roots in lots of things that work. We know that women in England and France who were later accused of witches did a lot of things, especially for childbirth. They understood women's anatomy and childbirth and all of that, and men at that time didn't have a clue and didn't care. So this medicine, you can look either way at it, but my feeling is that she did a lot of work in Old Town in 1815 to, say, 1830. We don't know when she died, helping the population to survive in those difficult times. Our next character is Flora Crock, and she's one of my favorites. How many of you have heard of Flora Crock? Not very many. That's good for me. Flora was born outside of St. Augustine, probably in the 1770s. She was a slave. She was born a slave to a slave mother. And what her mom did was to sell her own child outside of her family on the plantation where she lived at the age of 11 to a person in St. Augustine so that she could be a house slave. Her mother felt this was a better position for her child than being a laborer in the field. So that was her beginning. John Leslie was the gentleman who purchased her. He was not married at the time, and he was a partner in the company called Pantone Leslie and Company. They have an interesting backstory themselves, the partners in Pantone Leslie and Company. They started in Barbados and in Savannah, Georgia. They were all British. They started in the 1760s, 70s in Savannah. All of them were British loyalists. When the revolution came, they had to flee Savannah with their business. They moved it to St. Augustine, which was still a Spanish colony. So that was helpful to them. At the end of when the treaty was finally signed ending the American Revolution, the British had held Florida but went back to Spain. So they came to St. Augustine and became the exclusive monopoly authorized by the Spanish government traders with the natives in the area, particularly the Seminole and the Cherokee. What they were purchasing were furs, basically, from the natives and selling those in Spain and England. Very successful, very wealthy. Little boy named George Clark showed up at the age of 13 to apprentice to John Leslie in his trading company. He was very good at what he did, even though he only started at the age of 13. He had a small, tiny room in the back of John Leslie's personal home, and Flora was the house slave. They became very good friends, as the story goes, even though they knew they were unaware they weren't even supposed to be talking to each other. She wasn't supposed to be talking to anyone. Flora was 15, George was 11 at the time, 13 at the time, and they became very good friends. By 1793, when Flora was 18, she became pregnant. So I guess they were very good friends. But George Clark had his own pay docked. I know the writing on this particular page is too small. He had his own pay docked as an employee of his homeowner, John Leslie, and he purchased his own child's freedom after about a year. In another 2 years, he purchased Flora's freedom. He's now only about 17 or 18. Flora's about 3 years older than him, but he took care of that family that he had created in the home of John Leslie. He left the Leslie Company, and just south of St. Augustine, he purchased some land and became very successful in timber. He was called upon later on, though, to become the Surveyor General of the colony of Florida under Spanish rule. He was named Surveyor General, and in that role, he is the surveyor who laid out Old Town in 1811. That was the major accomplishment of his surveying career. He moved to Fernandina as well in 1811 and bought a prime lot on San Fernando Street and installed Flora there. He purchased the land in her name. Remember, free blacks she's now a free black, she could own property. And he was smart enough to purchase that land in her name so that if anything should happen to him, she would own that land. They had 8 children that they raised in their common law marriage. And interestingly, as I said about the 3 classes of people that were viewed in the territory of Florida, Flora was a free black, but she supervised 4 slaves within her own household. George Clark owned 10 slaves altogether. The other 6 worked at his lumber mill and timber operation. But she ran the house with the assistance of her 4 slaves. We don't know when Flora passed away. I could not find that information, but George married another free black woman named Hannah Benet in Old Town and had 4 more children. So he was pretty prolific. But when he passed away, Flora's 8 children inherited everything he owned. The money from the timber mill, the lumbering operation, all of that. The only thing that went to his 4 second-generation kids or 4 new kids was a $1,000 gift. So clearly he valued Flora very deeply for all the years that she was with him. This is an old photo of George Clark, and this is Bobby Morgan Jones, if any of you know her, and she made the best Flora Clark I have ever seen. Flora wore wonderful clothes. She was well-dressed, well-educated, a prominent member of the Old Town community because of the status of her husband, but also in her own right, and she was always very well-dressed. This was also taken at our reboot of the Tough Times, Strong Women. The next one I want to talk about is Mary Martha Reed. And Mary Martha Reed, I called it a tragic life of service. She was born in St. Mary's, very local, and Mary Martha Smith. She married Robert Reed in 1836. He became the territorial governor of Spain, of Florida in 1839, so she was the wife of a governor. She had 1 child with Mr. Reed, but unfortunately, she was only married to him for a very short time. She was 24 when she married him. She had a child, and in 1838, she married him in 1836, had a child in 1838, and he died in 1841. So that was her entire experience with marriage. I'm sorry, she had 2 children. I keep thinking about her other child. William died of yellow fever in 1842, a year after her husband died of yellow fever. So she had lost a son and a husband within 2 years and within 4 years of getting married. She was left with 1 son to support. As the wife of the governor, there was no retirement plan, so she was totally on her own. She started to work as a teacher in Jacksonville for a while, and then she came to Amelia Island. And this is an older picture of her because Mary Martha Reed wore black for the rest of her life. And the person that we have doing her as a first-person presenter has a gorgeous black gown trimmed in black lace, and that is what she wore for the rest of her life. Her other son joined the Confederacy, Raymond, in 1861, and she moves to Richmond, giving up her teaching career. She moves to Richmond, Virginia, to be near him. She doesn't want to lose another son, particularly that far away. The way things worked at that time was that each state in the Confederacy took care of their own wounded. So when she went up to Richmond, she, along with Dr. Thomas Palmer, founded the Florida Hospital, and that was what it was called. It took care of wounded Florida Confederate soldiers. There would be a Virginia hospital, there might be a Tennessee hospital. Not all of them were huge. Some of them were just tents and on-the-ground establishments. But the Florida Hospital got to be a very big brick building eventually. And she stayed there and watched over all the Florida boys who came in from the nearby battles and kept an eye on her son Raymond. She stayed there 4 years, ending up as matron, basically in charge of everything. And unfortunately, Raymond died at the Battle of the Wilderness. He was transported to the Florida Hospital, but he passed away before he could be taken to his mother in the hospital. He succumbed to his injuries. She was, of course, devastated. She's now lost her husband and 2 children. She leaves Richmond, it's now near the end of the Civil War. She leaves Richmond, just walks away from the hospital, and comes back to Florida to find another way to start another life. She was apparently on the same train out of Richmond as Andrew Jackson, and the train only took her as far as Abbeville, South Carolina. That's not very close to Florida. She walked the rest of the way home to Florida. Soldiers walked with her because many, many soldiers were walking south, and they took care of her all the way home. She went to Palatka, started a school, small elementary school, to support herself, and continued to do that work until she retired in 1879 to come to Fernandina to be with relatives and to take care of the children of her niece. Her niece had died in the yellow fever epidemic in 1879. Her niece had 3 children, I believe, and her nephew was Judge Thomas Swan. Her niece had married him. She raised those children for Judge Swan until they were of age. She died in 1894, and there are 2 windows in the St. Peter's Episcopal Church dedicated to her memory. One has a nurse and a Red Cross and many other indications of her 4 years of work in Richmond. The other one enshrines her as one of the very first daughters of the Confederacy. Our next woman, I forgot. Here are the 2 windows. Forgot there was a page for these. These are the 2 pages. This is the medical one, and notice here it shows not only the medical things, but a rifle, a telescope, mini balls or whatever those are, all the elements of all the parts she played in the Civil War. And the other one is much more decorous, would be the name, and it talks about nursing and caring for those who are sick and injured. She's buried in the church cemetery at St. Peter's Episcopal Church in a very beautiful lot. Our next women of Fernandina. Yes?
Yes, question. Is there a swan house here? Do we have a swan house?
I believe so. Do you know, Sarah?
Where they live?
It's a swan building.
Okay, so do you think that's the same?
Oh, yeah.
That's the John Chap.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, he was extremely prominent. His entire career, I believe, was in Fernandina. I don't know if there's a Swan house.
There is the Swan building on
Just the
Center
Swan
Street.
building.
Yeah, that's what I'm thinking
Swan
about.
building.
Okay.
Yeah, so I don't know where he lived. I'll look to Dickie for that information. The Sisters of St. Joseph. They came here. They played a huge role, not just in Fernandina. We hear so much about their work in Fernandina in the 1800s, but their presence was felt all over territorial Florida, and then later when we became a state. They started in France, in Le Puy, in 1650. It's one of the oldest orders in France, and it was founded by the ladies themselves. I'm in the middle of reading a book about them. There is a book that was written about them. It's a little bit of a slog because it's a lot of letters, but you get the feel of what these women went through as they moved from France to Florida. And what I mean by it was a convent supported by the women. They created it so that they could live together in a life of prayer. So it was not sanctioned by any particular Catholic church or archdiocese in France. They were on their own, and their mission was to provide medical care and education, which in the 1600s wouldn't have been a lot, but of course they progressed. In 1866, Bishop Verreau, who we've all heard of, at that time he was the Bishop of Savannah. There was no bishop in Florida. He recruited 20 sisters from this order. He was familiar with them and recruited 20 of them to come first to Savannah, where 3 or 4 of them stayed. The rest went to St. Augustine. Bishop Verreau was not there. They were put up in churches and boarding houses. and spent the next 5 months learning English. They knew zero English when they arrived in Savannah and were received by Bishop Verreau. I was reading the part about how they got from Savannah down to St. Augustine, and it was about 5 different boat rides. They were like hitching rides on these different boats and spoke zero English. There was no one with them. It was like, sending your kid with a piece of paper, please take care of this child. That's how they got to St. Augustine. When they got there, they supported themselves by making lace and by teaching, and that was their primary mission, was to teach. Bishop Verreau moved 9 of them to St. Augustine, from St. Augustine to Fernandina. 8 were split off and sent to Fernandina. They first started the school. They taught both black children and white children starting in 1866. They finally got a one-room school in 1871 when the St. Michael's Church, the original wooden building, was completed. They had a room in the back. When the full church was completed 2 years later, they were also able to petition to have their own school built. And in 1873, I believe, it's not in there, but in 1873, the beginnings of what is now St. Michael's Academy was started as St. Joseph's Academy and was completed within a year. In that area, they were now up to 8 to 10 sisters, and they were teaching both black children and white children in schoolrooms in that church. Their next issue that they dealt with was the yellow fever epidemic. This is the Verreau house on North 4th. It was the home of the sisters after Bishop Verreau decided they really didn't need to be living in the attic on the 3rd floor of the St. Joseph's Academy. Bishop Verreau, when he arrived in St. Augustine in 1874, purchased this home for the 8 sisters to live in. They used it, the backyard, for their vegetable garden, and they cooked communally and lived very simply and took care of the school. In 1877, the first of our 2 yellow fever epidemics arrived here. Over 1,100 of the 1,300 residents in town got sick. So there was nobody to take care of anybody. Everyone turned to these 8 sisters for help. People were sending flour sacks and pieces of fabric through these windows, which were open so that people could communicate with the sisters, and they were making shrouds for bodies and handing them back out the windows as people died. They also cooked and cooked and cooked from the vegetables and everything they had in their backyard, and were passing out food to anyone who came by who needed it. And many, many people, of course, came by and took it back to their families because most of them were sick. Of those 1,100 who were infected, only 94 died, but that's a pretty big percentage in the town, and it took a long time for the town of Fernandina to recover. During that time, 2 of the sisters fell ill, 1 day apart, and they both died within 3 days of yellow fever. And they were buried, some reports say they were buried in the backyard. Some reports say they were buried near the Mater Fernandez Grant, which sits now between the St. Michael's Catholic Church and the St. Joseph Academy. If you've gone by there, there's a little walled-in burial site. Some reports said they were buried in the backyard of their own home. Some say they were buried over at the church. After that abated, they continued their work. The school building, 1882 was built. I had that date wrong. And the remaining sisters who couldn't fit in the Verreau house now had to live back in the attic on the 3rd floor. The Sisters of St. Joseph, as I mentioned, they weren't just here. They operated 36 elementary and secondary schools across the state of Florida under Bishop Verreaux's guidance in the late 1800s, early 1900s, and up to 1960. They also operated about 5 schools, I think it was 4 or 5 schools for the handicapped within the state of Florida. So they made a tremendous impact even on the state of Florida. I wanted to mention that they closed the school in 1960. There was less need for their teaching activities, and this building sat empty for almost 25 years before St. Michael's purchased it, which is an interesting story, and eventually in the 1990s, late 1990s, early 2000s, it became St. Michael's Academy. It's interesting because all that land on which St. Michael's, I'm sure most of you have been by there, are familiar with it. St. Michael's Church is there. The Mater Fernandez Grant, where they are buried, is in the middle. And at the north end is St. Joseph's Academy. Until St. Michael's Church purchased the St. Joseph Academy building, that lot was owned by 3 different entities. Everyone thinks, oh, the Maters left that for the Catholic Church. They didn't really. The Archdiocese of St. Augustine built St. Michael's Catholic Church on what's the southern third of that square block. The sisters, the Order of the Sisters of Dupuy in France, owned the land at the north end of that block where the school sat. They owned that land and that school. That was given to them. The land in the middle is still, the small burial area is still called the Mater Fernandez Grant, and does not belong to the Catholic Church, which sits right next to it. Nina Villalonga, who was the last of the Mater Fernandez women who lived there, left an endowment for the care of that burial plot with the Catholic Church, but the Catholic Church does not own it. So St. Michael's and the diocese actually had to buy this building from the sisters when they created the St. Michael's Academy. So it's kind of interesting story of how that land happened to flow. I don't think I have another one. Yeah, I do have one more. 11 sisters are buried at Boscobello Cemetery, all in this one area. The last was Sister Anna Josephine Perbeau. She was retired. They dissolved themselves after the last Mother Superior passed away in 1930. They continued their work, but they were not as consistent, or they didn't continue the church for as long. She passed away in 1956 and was the last one buried at Boscobello Cemetery. But the Mother Superior that I mentioned, who passed away in 1930, that was the last Mother Superior that they had at the St. Joseph Academy and living quarters. Her name was Mother Antonia, and she must have been a force of nature. I don't know very much about her, but the one thing I did read about her was that for her funeral in 1930, every single business in Fernandina shut down for the day of her funeral, and her pallbearers, of which there must have been many, came from every single church in Fernandina, which was about 12 churches. So she must have been a force of nature. I don't know much else about her. This is Becky Maley, being one of the Sisters of St. Joseph. I asked her to pose for me, and I guess she decided she needed to be genteel and reverent and close her eyes. Okay, our last one, probably the one you've been waiting for. Everybody knows Flossie Borden. Flossie was born Flossie Renard, and she was actually born in St. John's in Newfoundland. She's a Newfoundlander. In 1887. She was raised in Brooklyn, New York. Her father was a sea captain out of New York City, very prosperous. On one of the family's trip, her parents were with her. They came down to Amelia Island, where her father had been many times. He was in the timber business as well, and often stopped here to pick up timber, which was the big product of the area in the late 1800s. They were coming on our twice weekly, which we had steamer service from Charleston then, and Flossie was about 17. There are differences of opinion on her age in here. Thea and I discussed this at length, but I stuck with her being 17 on that trip. She met Nathaniel Borden on that steamship. He was 52. Apparently, at one point during the trip, they were out at the rail, probably in the evening, we don't know, and her father came out. And he was not at all happy that she was out unchaperoned at 17 with this 52-year-old man at the rail of the steamer. I asked Thea if this was true, and she said it is. They got into a fight, and the one who ended up overboard was Flossie's father. So they went back and got him because he was still her parents, but Thea says that's true. Their parents, when they got to Fernandina, refused to allow her to see Mr. Borden. That didn't go over so well with Flossie, and it didn't go so well with Mr. Borden. He was a very wealthy man. He was one of the biggest timber barons of the time in Florida, in Fernandina. At that time, we had 6 or 7 timber mills within the broader area of Fernandina, so that was the thing that was going on after the Civil War. He was also known as a supporter of Jose Marti, and I need Berta Arias here to kind of make that connection, but Jose Marti came here several times, arranged for the purchase of guns and ammunition for the ongoing or beginning Cuban Revolution at that time, and dealt extensively with Nathaniel Borden. And it's thought that probably Nathaniel Borden smuggled a number of those ammunition and rifle purchases to Cuba, because he also had two timber mills in Cuba. So it was very easy for him to go back and forth. They met at the Florida house where Jose Marti stayed when he came to visit, and he was really the key person in the organization of the Cuban Revolution. He wasn't a very good soldier. I think he died in like the first or second battle of the Cuban Revolution. He should have stuck to just being an administrator. But Nathaniel Borden was known for his support of the Cuban Revolution. So, not surprisingly, Flossie and Nathaniel eloped to Florida and got married against the wishes of her father in 1905. He called her Flossie. She called him Honey. She called him Honey his entire life. And that's a picture of him in the middle with Jose Marti. It's the only picture I have of him. Here's the bride's home. There are 2 significant bride's homes in Fernandina, Villa Las Palmas and, of course, the Bailey House. This one was built by Honey in 1908 for Flossie. You get a much better look at it in this older home. It's about 12,000 square feet, which I find enormously. Dickie, have you ever been inside? You have. Not very many people have. I would love to see it, but it has, I believe, correct me if I'm wrong, a ballroom that goes front to back on the first floor. And then upstairs on the same side are billiard areas and game areas and other things. That was the original layout. And their bedrooms were upstairs. There was a widow's walk on the top so that Flossie could go out and see the ships in the harbor and see if Honey was coming or going. And has a beautiful winding staircase. And the grounds were much more glorious than they were now. It's now very protected. They say that it's because people come up and knock on the door because of the name on the house and they think it's open, but it's not. So anyway, The story everyone knows about Villa Las Palmas, the driveway was on the side street. This is Alachua that this photo was taken from. Nathaniel bought Flossie a car around 1917, 1918. It was the second car on the island, and he taught her how to drive. The first car on the island belonged to Dr. Wass. We still have the Wass Pharmacy. Back then in the 1910s and 1917s, Dr. Wass was a pharmacist and a physician, which was very common back then. And Flossie was backing her car out of the driveway, and she ran into Dr. Wass with her car. 2 cars on the island, first accident on the island. So, the Wass Pharmacy is still here 3 generations later. Here's the car like she would have had, and that's her on the left driving, and she they traveled extensively, they entertained all the time, but the Depression was not good to Nathaniel Borden. One of the things he kind of missed, and if certain docents, if you go on our docent tour, they talk about the things that caused the city, the town of Fernandina, to crash. And one of those things that is less talked about was that the St. Johns River began to be dredged in the early 1900s, 1890s into the 1900s. Before that, it was not navigable by large ships. You know, look at it now, it gets dredged all the time and they get bigger and bigger. But back then, it was a very shallow river. When that dredging began, we were also running out of timber to float down the St. Mary's River to feed all these sawmills. A number of people moved towards Jacksonville with timbering and milling operations. Nathaniel Borden did not. He stayed here. And into the early 1930s, he lost everything during the Depression. And he passed away in 1938 and is buried at Boscobello. Flossie is still very, very young. She attempted to hold on to Villa Las Palmas with whatever money she had remaining, but that was not successful. She was only 50 or 51. He was 86 when he died, and it was, of course, a tremendous blow to her. She sold Villa Las Palmas 6 years after Nathaniel died for $12,000, which sounds like nothing. She moved for a while with the Herths on South 7th Street, and stayed there a bit until she figured out what she was going to do with her life. And in the end, she moved to D.C. because their only son, William, was a captain in the Navy and was stationed at that time in D.C. The only other story that I believe is true about her is that she deposited the grandfather clock that was in the front hall of Villa Las Palmas. She deposited that for safekeeping with the Herths on 7th Street. She went on to D.C. where she passed away. Her wish had been to be buried in the case of that grandfather clock. I don't know if it was a wedding present to her, but she had a lot of affection for the grandfather clock. The problem was she didn't fit. She had put on a few lbs, as they say, in that time, and my understanding is that the clock is still at the Herth House. She is actually buried in Arlington National Cemetery beside her son. She is not buried here in Boscobello with her husband. She chose to be buried with their son, William. Oh, I kind of jumped ahead of myself. She passed away in 1952. This is the Herth House where she left her clock. Oh, and his name was Nathaniel Borden Jr. And the Herths, as you know, were the owners of the Palace Saloon for several years, and that was the time at which she moved in with him. She is buried at Arlington National Cemetery, and the grandfather clock is still at the Herth House. Those are my 5 ladies. I don't have a picture of Flossie in her first-person presenter costume. We've had 2 people since I've been here who have played Flossie, and they both looked incredible in the costume we had for her, which was a driving coat, very much like she had with her car. Any questions about the Any questions? No? Yes.
What types of primary sources are there about Felipe and Flora Crock?
You should know the answer. The deed records for Old Town are the best one, and they do list her as a landowner and a free woman. Beyond that, I didn't go too far into her business dealings or whether there was any evidence of that, but there is reference to her business being on Lady Street, which makes sense. Lady Street is where all the ladies of the evening were, and they were probably her best customers, either trying to figure out how not to get pregnant or how to not be pregnant if you were, or cure anything that our lovely sailors brought along with them. So that was probably the biggest part of her business. Yeah.
Great job, Susan.
Thank you.
It's any of us that love to dig in the archives here and all of that. There are probably 50 amazing women in that period of time that have equally incredible stories. Really amazing.
Yeah,
amazing.
The 2 we left out of this that I didn't do, and I probably would have had time for one, and one of my favorites is Chloe Merrick.
Chloe Merrick was one,
Yeah, and we left out Mary Mater because so many people know the history of Mary and Old Town and, the Fernandez Ranch and all of that. That's a long story if you tell the whole Mary Mater story. So
and Kate Bailey.
And Kate Bailey. Oh, yeah. But Chloe Merrick is one of my favorites.
Yeah, it's so tied into the history of the country at that time.
Yeah, I'll just say very briefly, she grew up in New York, near Syracuse, and also very near Seneca Falls, and actually heard Susan B. Anthony speak at her church in New York, near Seneca Falls. And she, when she was born, her brothers and two brothers and a sister, I think they were 17, 18, and 20 when she was born, and her mother died shortly after her birth. Her father was working in lumbering or something and was away from home a lot. She was basically raised by her 2 brothers and her sister and had a very liberal education in all sense of the words. One of her brothers and her sister was a teacher, so she received a very broad and very liberal education, and that area of New York was very liberal at that time. It was the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in that particular area. And she came down here in 1862 to become a teacher. She answered an ad from the Freedmen's Bureau in Florida to come here and become a teacher of obviously black children who could not read or write, but freed black slaves who had fled. They weren't necessarily, they were either free or they fled here from other places. So she taught blacks for quite a few years. She did 2 really neat things. She bought the Finnegan Mansion, which was a 40-room mansion at the site of the elementary school. Is that right? It occupied the whole block where the Fernandina Elementary School. She bought it on the schoolhouse steps for taxes. Because Finnegan, who was a general in the Confederacy, was out of town and he hadn't paid his taxes. So in 1863, she bought his house and turned it into an orphanage for black children. In 1863, late 1863, she bought what is now called the Merrick Summer House. Merrick Summer House, which is on South 10th. She also bought that on the courthouse steps. So she was a very clever woman. It had been for a very short time a Union hospital, and she lived there and ran it as a boarding house while she taught at the orphanage and the church. Her very first church was housed at St. Peter's Episcopal Church. She lost the Finnegan house when he showed back up and paid over $15,000 in back taxes. She lost that. She went back to New York. Some reports say for her health, others probably to spend some time with her family. But the person she had met while she was here buying those things off the courtyard steps was Robert Reed. Robert, is that correct? I don't have my notes on her. He was the tax surveyor, making sure that all these sales were legally appropriate to be undertaken. He fell in love with her. She was in her 30s by now. And she went back to New York. She couldn't resist continuing to work for the Freedmen's Bureau. She went to North Carolina to work and teach. He went up to North Carolina and proposed to her when she was 37 years old. And she married him. They went back to New York. He went all the way back to New York to Seneca Falls for the wedding. And then he became governor of Florida. And her mission from that point on was public schools for Florida. And that particular governor founded the first university in Florida and lots of public schools, and she was clearly very much behind that. Lived a very significant life.
So was that the same Reed that was involved with
No.
Harry Reed?
No. I know. I thought that until I started doing research, because we throw these names around. Mary Martha Reed was R-E-I-D.
Oh, okay.
And Chloe Merrick Reed was R-E-E-D. Unconnected. But interesting. Yeah, Peggy.
That was just fabulous. Thank you so much. And I really want to encourage people to explore the archive, but it really brings up the fact I keep thinking of all the women today who, Dee Dee Bartles and Joanne Bean, who's passed away, or Mavini Betch. Women in Fernandina continue to make huge contributions. So
they're fearless, they're strong, they're educated, I think fearless is one of the words that Mary Mater in 1887, when the census was taken, the first Spanish census, on Amelia Island, Mary Mater, her 2 kids, and a farmhand. Every time I do a docent tour, I say to these people, can you imagine being left here as the only 4 people on this island, and you're on your own? And the kids were, at that time, like 12 and 8, 12 and 9. The women here are just fearless. Very cool. Thank you.
Yeah. Is there any evidence that Flora and Philippa knew each other? They were contemporaries?
They were very much contemporaries, yes. But there's no evidence that they knew each other. Thank you.